and we'd really enjoy the chance to explore questions with you.
Great, and thank you very much to you, Chairman Kerry, to Senator Lugar for this session and also for your longstanding commitment on this issue. We also would like to acknowledge the administration's pledge to prioritize climate change and to really re-engage in the global negotiations, as was mentioned in the first panel. My goal today is to provide input on this important discussion from the perspective of CARE, an international development and relief organization that's been working in partnership with the poorest communities around the world for 60 years, fighting poverty, and try to represent the interest of poor communities on two aspects of the Bali Action Plan: forestry and the issue of deforestation that's already been raised, and adaptation. And I would just say that my overall message is that beyond our part to preserve the planet, as has been talked about already in our U.S. climate policy and legislation, we must also respond to the impact that climate change will have on people in the world's poorest communities. And so that in that context, I will make my remarks. There's obviously growing body of evidence that shows that the cost of doing business as usual with energy and the environment is going to pull the rug out from underneath the progress that the world is making with the important Millennium Development Goals. As has already been mentioned, people in extreme poverty who are already living on the edge of crisis are going to have climate change push them over that ledge, whether it's from reducing agricultural productivity, increasing water stress, health risks, frequency and severity and intensity of weather-related hazards. And as has already been mentioned, in addition, unmitigated climate change is likely to have an impact on global security and global instability, whether contributing to mass migration, refugee crisis, increased scarcity of natural resources. And I would just take a moment to thank the chair for the work on Sudan. And I think, as you mentioned, if you go to Darfur, if you go to Sudan, you see what that impact is already in some places. Ultimately, climate change is going to have its greatest impact on the poorest communities and most marginalized groups, including women and girls, which is a major focus of our organization. Now, to avoid this scenario, I want to just touch briefly on three recommendations related to deforestation and adaptation that we believe can make an impact, understanding that the U.S. has to act aggressively to put in place policies to effect deep and immediate reductions in domestic greenhouse gas emissions that people have already touched on. So my three recommendations relate to protecting the rights within the context of the reduction of emissions from deforestation and forest degradation in developing countries, or so-called REDD, funding adaptation, making sure that there are set-asides of substantial revenues, new and additional, to our official development assistance to support adaptation in developing countries that are vulnerable to climate change, and three, to reach the poorest and the most vulnerable with these funds to ensure that adaptation funding actually reaches and responds to the priority of the poorest populations who are most vulnerable. Let me just give a bit of detail about each of those very quickly. First of all, the issue of protecting rights under REDD. Clearly, to reach mitigation goals, we need to make sure that we reduce emissions from deforestation and degradation in the U.S. climate change legislation, because it does account for about 20% of human-induced greenhouse gas emissions. But REDD activities must include pro-poor social standards and safeguards. We know from our experience that conservation efforts are going to be much more effective if they also recognize communities' central role in forest conservation and protect their rights and ensure that they have a livelihood in the context of reducing degradation and deforestation. So example, and we cite several examples in our written testimony, CARE worked in Nepal with Weyerhaeuser Company, USAID, and World Wildlife to have a three-pronged approach that promoted conservation and biodiversity, strengthened economic development, but also worked on changing government policies, forest policies in Nepal to make sure that they were responsive to the needs of the poor. We're going to continue to do projects like this, working in partnership with environmental groups to use these models to demonstrate the ability to conserve natural resources, but also to make sure that livelihoods are maintained and that policies are changed in the meantime that meet the needs of the poor. Second recommendation, new funds for adaptation in developing countries. And people have mentioned this and touched on this, but I think it's important to recognize that this is going to be key. Past emissions have already set in motion the changes that we've talked about, and it's important that we recognize the need for adaptation on the ground. The estimates are large for this, so this is not something that can be done on the cheap. The estimates of international adaptation needs are as high as $86 billion a year by the year 2015. Now, there's a range of estimates here, but it's clear that we're talking about tens of billions of dollars if we want to meet the adaptation needs. But we also know that investing in adaptation today is going to save dollars tomorrow, perhaps in the range of $1 prevention for for $7 that would cost us in the future. It's going to save lives, and it also is going to build resiliency in communities to be able to withstand the ongoing climate change that has already occurred. Funding international adaptation is also the right thing to do. The world's poor are the least responsible for the climate change and are the most severely impacted. So understanding all the issues about our own domestic concerns, clearly it's the right thing to do. We have been most responsible for the climate change that others are suffering for. And finally, number 3 point, assuring that adaptation funds reach those at greatest needs. And as I've mentioned before, the best way to do that is to make sure that local communities are empowered to facilitate ownership and adaptation of strategies, and ownership of adaptation strategies. And I will just again point out we've included several examples in our written testimony, but the good news is that we already know how to do that. In Tajikistan, for instance, we're working with women to develop greenhouses to be able to grow more food because the winter season has already lengthened and decreased agricultural productivity. In Kenya, we're helping communities build sand dams in freshwater rivers to capture and store water for use during longer seasons. In Bangladesh, women have identified duck rearing as an adaptation option as opposed to chickens, which is oftentimes a use of livelihoods, because ducks float during these more frequently occurring floods. So there are simple ways in which communities have already found ways to adapt to climate change, and we want to be able to help support them in their ability to do some of the very simple things that can make a difference in saving lives and providing livelihoods. Finally, in conclusion, I'll just say, I think as everyone has said before, the opportunity to make a difference is extraordinary. Clearly, it is vital that the U.S. pass domestic legislation that does reduce U.S. greenhouse gas emissions, but also that protects the rights and interests of forest-dependent communities around the world, funds international adaptation, and guides those funds so that they reach the people in poor countries most vulnerable to climate change. This is the time to act. As everybody says, this is urgent, not only for us, but for others around the world. So, again, I thank you, and we have full written testimony that's already been submitted.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kamudi.